Well, welcome everyone to another session of the Beyond Access series. My name is Jose Rios. I'm the Director of Family Empowerment and Communications here at the Division of Specialized Instruction and Student Support. I'm going to start talking slower because we have interpreters for Spanish, for Mandarin, and ASL, and I don't want Greenie's hands to catch on fire. So this is normally where I would jump into the hosting duties, but tonight I want to bring in my right hand for the Beyond Access series, and your host for this evening will actually be Ori Balaish, our amazing family empowerment coordinator. So Ori, take it away.
Thank you, Jose. I'm honored to be tonight's host. As Jose said, my name is Ori, and I work with Jose on the Beyond Access series with the Division of Specialized Instruction and Student Support. And so we are, of course, very excited to be joined by the Cerebral Palsy Foundation again to continue with the award-winning 4-part series, Just Say Hi, with the Beyond Access series. Tonight's webinar is the part 3 of the series called Power of Language, Words Matter. So we will learn some key concepts and definitions addressing disability and how its language has evolved. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes as always. As a general reminder, there will be no chat function during tonight's session, but the Q&A function will be on for you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we can answer any questions during the session as best as we can, but also we do set time aside at the end to answer all your questions then as well. And as always as well, we want to make sure that you are aware that this session will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page the following day. So don't worry if you miss any content throughout today's webinar, as you'll be able to watch it again on our YouTube channel. If you don't follow our YouTube page, what are you doing? Go and follow. We have some great content there related to special education, as well as all our Beyond Access series from previous and obviously to tonight's tomorrow as well. So without any further ado, I want to hand it over to the Cerebral Palsy team, to Rachel and Ashley.
Ashley, you're on mute.
Good evening, everyone. Hope y'all are having a fabulous evening. We're so excited to be here with you to present the 4th part of our Inclusion Matters series on the power of language. So to introduce myself, I'm Ashley Harris-Whaley, and I manage engagement and communities at the Cerebral Palsy Foundation. So tonight you will be hearing us, speaking of language and its power, we'll be intentionally varying our language usage between person-first language and identity-first language to respect the differing preferences of the disability community. I'm a white woman. I have long curly brown hair. I'm wearing a navy blue shirt, and I'm sitting in my office. So first up is to introduce y'all to disability activist. This is Cheryl Marie Wade, and this quote from Cheryl really speaks to the fact that disability history and culture isn't really something that we're familiar with, right? It's not something that is taught in schools or is shared widely. And this is something that we discussed in a previous webinar in this series on disability history and laws. So if you haven't had the chance to watch that, I highly recommend going back and giving that one a watch. But a lot of disability history, which isn't often taught, the reason for that being is that a lot of the narrative around disability, around our history, and around the language that we're using to talk about disability and talk to disabled people. So a lot of that narrative has been not driven by disabled people themselves, which has kind of led to it missing the mark a little bit, so to speak. So that's something that we're going to dive into this evening. So if the narrative around language and around disability in general is missing the mark, then who should be leading these conversations around language and disability? exceptionally easy answer, and that is people with disabilities. Conversation should be guided by listening to and learning from the language that people with disabilities use to self-describe and self-identify. So I've said a bit of this already, but historically that conversation hasn't been led by disabled people. And what that has given us is a whole host of language that doesn't label disability directly for what it is. So this is a fantastic quote from Emily Liddell. She is a writer and a speaker and a disability activist. And she's speaking to us here about how we can actually use language as a direct signal that we're either accepting or rejecting a person's identity. And so much of the language that's used around disability kind of by default rejects disability by calling it something else, by giving it a different name. And so what we don't want for our students, right? We don't want them to feel alienated or to feel othered by any language that's used when speaking to them or used in reference to them. And a lot of these terms that are on this slide here, like I said, they're created for the sole purpose of talking around disability rather than labeling it clearly and honestly. So instead of that, here, we have this list of euphemisms, things like differently abled or handy-capable or special needs or learning differences. And you'll notice that the R word isn't included in this list because that goes a step beyond a euphemism. And so that's considered to be a true slur. And I've actually recently learned, this is an interesting fact, because we're all learning all the time, right? That some folks are even considering the word handicapped as a slur as well. So this euphemistic language, we're all about inclusion, right? And this euphemistic language, it isn't inclusive. It's rather alienating, actually. So but it's important to acknowledge some folks in the disability community, and I've personally met a few of them, they prefer to use language that is more euphemistic. So even if that isn't the preference of the majority of the disability community necessarily, it is the preference of some individuals, and that preference should always be respected. And no disabled person should be corrected by a non-disabled person or anyone else on the language that they're using in reference to themselves. So throughout this series, we've been introducing y'all to community and using these introductions to really showcase the power of representation and the importance of representation in the conversation of inclusion. And it lets us also just show you really how brilliant and diverse the disability community actually is. So this is Annie Segarra. She is known as Annie Elaney on YouTube, and she has just some great videos that really speak to the language conversation. And in this video, Annie is talking about the power of using words like disability and disabled and person with a disability as opposed to other euphemisms. So I'll let you hear directly from her.
Versus the plethora of words created that word. All right, so disability is not a bad word, even if society tried to make it into one. Hashtag disabled, not Voldemort. Hashtag say the word disabled. I personally, when being referred to, I cannot stand terms like differently abled. Because specifically differently abled, I feel like it's such a big cop out. Like everyone has different abilities. Everyone is differently abled. Erases the oppression that people within the disability community face. Then stuff like special and handicapped and handy-capable, I do not like any of them, but only recently this year did I learn that handicapped itself is actually considered a slur. I didn't know that. I think the word disability is important. I think it's important to recognize and remember that there is a specific community of people that have historically been oppressed and continue to be oppressed to this day. And I think it's important for that community of people to have the word disability and have the word disabled and to be able to have disability pride and be proud and be out in the world as disabled. All right, I think.
So tonight on this webinar, I'm joined by Rachel Byrne, who's the incomparable director of the Cerebral Palsy Foundation. So she is going to pick it up from here.
Thank you so much, Ashley. As Ashley mentioned, my name is Rachel Byrne. I'm the Executive Director at the Cerebral Palsy Foundation. I'm a white woman with brown hair that's tied back, and I am wearing a black sweater. And so, you know, I think we've just sort of seen these different components, both what Ashley described and what Annie described. So why do so many terms exist to use in place of the words disability or disabled? And I think historically it's because disability makes people feel uncomfortable. And I think what we're really trying to do, both within these webinars and really within our curriculum, is actually show the opposite, that inclusion is so powerful. And we need to make sure that people feel fully included. And the way to do that is that we cannot erase a part of their identity by not saying the word. And I think it's really important. We shouldn't be trying to make things more palatable for individuals because they do feel discomfort. I think we actually need to get to the core of, well, why is that word making somebody uncomfortable? Using the word disability actually connects the disabled population and people to a community and a culture, and it is so important. And as Ashley said, if you get a chance to go back and watch Disability in History and Laws, it is an extraordinary webinar that really shows where history has come from in this country with the disability civil rights movement, and you can really meet some extraordinary people who have participated in that. And I think we really need to make sure that language is protected under law. So it's something that we really need to make sure that we are evolving with, you know, actually paying attention to and trying to be as precise as possible. So if we're thinking about this, what do we want for our students? Well, of course, we want our students to feel empowered by language that's used in reference to them. And we can empower students by using a variety of combination of person-first language and identity-first language. And you will see us doing that throughout this webinar. And I think rather than worrying about the rest of the world's comfort, our focus should be the inclusion and empowerment of students with disabilities, because we know words matter. And I think as we go through all of this, you'll see, well, what actions can I take? How can I change, whether it be actually some minor changes in our day-to-day language? Sometimes it might be major. But we can all intentionally think about how we use words and think about, most importantly, how they're impacting others. So, person-first language. Simply put, it is putting personhood ahead of disability. And so it separates a person from their disability. So, for example, person with a disability, person with cerebral palsy, person with Tourette's syndrome. If we're now looking at identity-first language, it's putting the disability as an identity. So it integrates a person with their disability fully. And again, there is a preference that people use, and it can be that you go between both. It can be that you have a preference to strongly only use one. And this is an example by Tiffany Hammond, who is a mother who has autism herself, and her son also has autism. And so she describes it, I am autistic, my son has autism. So she interchangeably uses both person first and identity first language, depending on what she is describing, if she's describing herself or if she's describing her son. And I think some individuals really choose to identify as an individual with a disability in certain circumstances or at different points in their lives. So I think this is important as well. How somebody may have felt growing up as a student or through childhood may change when they go to college and may change through adulthood. And I think that needs to be respected as well. So if we're navigating language preferences, so I think we need to recognize that the default language used in the majority of school settings is person first language. And it sort of is taught as what is best in most educational settings and programs. But I think what we're trying to show is actually the flexibility in being able to go between both, understanding people's individual preferences is something that, you know, to be able to recognize that and have respect for the people that you're speaking with or the people that you're communicating with in that moment is so important. But we also know, okay, well, what do we do if we are unsure? And we want to work within the systems and the frameworks that currently exist. So, for example, we also know that special needs is used within the school system. So, you know, understanding that that is used is important when we're describing certain things and when we're having those conversations. And now I'll hand it over to Ashley to keep talking about how we actually ask about language preferences.
Right. So now that, you know, we kind of have a handle on what the disability community prefers and how we're going to navigate within existing systems that we have, you know, how do we actually do that navigating? It's kind of an ask, right? So the easiest thing to do is, instead of assuming that what we've been taught or what we already know is best, you know, how do we go about instead figuring out what an individual student or a small group of students, you know, what is their language preference and how do we suss that out? Well, the simple act of asking whenever we can, that's an act of inclusion in and of itself. But how will a child know how to navigate language usage and what feels right to them and what feels good to them and what, you know, they're wanting to be called? And we do that through exposure, because kids will say that, but, you know, kids and adolescents, putting on my speech language pathologist hat for just like one quick second, we know that they acquire and use language that they hear. So if they're getting exposure equally to person first language and identity first language, then that gives them the opportunity to hear both. And in cases whenever it's applicable, to really begin the process of deciding for themselves what they prefer and what feels best for them. You know, as a personal example, kind of talking about how you can sort of switch back between one or the other, and you don't necessarily have to make a hard and fast choice. So on a personal level, I tend to prefer identity first language when speaking generally. So I would refer to myself as a disabled person almost all the time. I don't really see that I'm able to extract my disability from my identity, but I would also refer to myself as a person with cerebral palsy if we were talking about specifics. So that just really speaks to the versatility of both of these language models and how they can be used. And the most important thing to do as adults in the situation is to listen to the cues that a person is giving you. Like, you know, my parents used to almost exclusively refer to me as a person with a disability. And then they heard me begin the process of like learning and self-education and referring to myself as a disabled person. So they really followed my lead on that. And when you're navigating these situations, if the language that you're using is making the person with a disability uncomfortable, or you can kind of tell that you're picking up on their cues, right? Then ask them. And I know that last webinar, we talked about a lot about what to not to ask. So in this specific instance, we're really speaking to asking about language preferences specifically, which is akin to, think of it as like asking a person what their pronouns are or something along those lines. We're again not talking about just like a full pass to ask disabled people whatever question might strike someone's fancy. Pretty big distinction there. So, how can we translate all of this into action? We can, because I know that like all of us on this webinar probably have a student or multiple students in our lives that we care about, and how are we helping them through the process of like learning about language and what to use and what feels good. So this is, obviously going to depend on the age of the child or the student, and thinking about how language preferences are probably going to change as a child ages and matures. Just like in many other areas of a person's life, how we see ourselves and our identity, it changes a lot, especially in those really formative years. And so we can really listen to the children and the students in our life, and how are they organically communicating? Like, what are they organically saying? Like, of course we're modeling and we've been modeling, but like also what are they saying and what language are they using in reference to themselves? It's all about an evolving process of choice. Like, not to keep coming back to myself, but I really am my own best example 99% of the time. I used to have no problem with euphemistic language. Like, I wouldn't say that I preferred it. I certainly like never enjoyed anyone calling me differently abled or special needs, but I probably wouldn't have gave them a talking to about it either. I would have just accepted it and moved on when I was in middle school or maybe even high school. But as I got older, of course, I began to have pretty strong opinions about those topics. And odds are most students are going to follow some kind of trajectory when it comes to the language that they feel comfortable using in reference to themselves. And it's true to say that language evolves, right? And this is any language that we're using, not just language that we're using specifically in reference to disability, but since that is the topic of the hour, it might feel kind of hard, like it's a difficult task to keep up with the constant evolution of this language, like terms that might have been okay 30 years ago or 10 years ago or this year, 10 months ago, those might not be like acceptable or preferred terms any longer. And that's okay. As long as we're listening and we're learning and we're open to change, there's always going to be room for a well-intentioned error. And it's okay to give yourself the permission to unlearn and then relearn the use of your language here. So when we might think of some more like pretty blatant things that we've already spoken about, like maybe the word handicap or the R word. What we might not immediately think about, pervasiveness of really casual, sort of thrown around ableist language. So I'm a disabled person and I work in this space, but still on my online platforms, I often get a good call in from someone in the disability community for accidentally saying something that might be considered ableist. None of us are immune to it, but what we can all do is be more mindful of the language that we're using. And these are some examples. So words like lame or spaz or spastic, crazy, stupid, dumb, phrases like tone deaf or the blind leading the blind. And then this is a very popular one, sort of using the names of specific mental health conditions or other conditions very flippantly, like, oh, I'm OCD or something along those lines. And they're so casual. They're a part of our lexicon and we say them without even thinking about it most of the time. But that doesn't mean that that's okay. And that doesn't mean that they're not hurtful to disabled people. And a lot of them at one time probably felt, one time might have been like this morning, if we're, being perfectly honest with ourselves. But the fact of the matter is that all of them are really quite rooted in ableism and in the stigma surrounding disability and disabled people. And another one I think we should think about is the use of functioning labels. So saying that someone is high functioning or low functioning, those are very commonly used. I know in school settings and healthcare settings, pretty much everywhere. But think about it this way: what other group of human beings has like functioning labels applied to them as a way of like addressing or explaining their competency? None that I can think of. So we really should move away from using those and instead use things that speak more clearly to what we're talking about. So when we're using those labels, what we're trying to say is that someone has either a low support need or a high support need to have their access needs met. And I'm going to let y'all hear from Queen yet again to give us a crash course of sorts on this more casual ableist language.
Hello. It's Let's Talk Tuesday. So let's talk about language. Ableism, specifically casual ableism, is widely accepted in our society, particularly when it comes to our language. No wonder most people don't care about access or equality when it comes to people with disabilities if our everyday language perpetuates the idea that they are lesser. Ableism is constantly used to insult others or describe something as negative. And oftentimes, people don't even realize where these words are coming from, what these words mean. So, warning, I'm about to possibly throw out some slurs and otherwise really offensive terms for people with disabilities for sake of example. First, there's using disabilities as insults. Remember those campaigns to stop saying that's so gay? Because why are you using homosexuality to express something negative? Okay, so in that same breath of campaigns, creating awareness of harmful language, we should have included the word lame. Do you know what lame means? It means someone who can't walk or walks with pain and or difficulty. Ding, 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 ding. After learning the word's true definition, go ahead, look it up for yourself. I promise you, that's what the dictionary will say. And I certainly no longer feel comfortable using it in that way. It's very clear that people knew what it meant, and they started using it to describe things in a negative way. Now, things like the word lame are, for the most part, very unintentional. A lot of people do not know what that word means or where it comes from. But then another common thing is how people literally use disability in order to insult or condescend to someone. What are you, blind? Are you deaf? What is wrong with you? Are you mentally ill? You need help. You seriously need help. Nut job.
Sorry, guys, we've had a little freeze. So Annie does a better job of that discussion than most of us could, but we've talked about students' exposure through hearing both identity first language and person first language from folks that are directly in their sphere of influence. But what about exposure to language and different communication modalities through accurate disability representation? We've said this before in almost every module of our series so far, but the disability community is really a resource for education and representation among folks who are using varied language and modalities of communication. It really serves a twofold purpose. It introduces these forms of communication among the general population, and it also creates opportunity for students with disabilities who may use a different communication modality or a different language or way of communicating to identify and to feel seen and included. So we have been conditioned to perceive verbal communication as the ultimately superior communication modality. And like I said, I'm a speech language pathologist by trade, so I have seen this conditioning up close and personal, both in providers within the healthcare system, but also within parents and families. And the truth is there is no superior communication modality. The superior communication modality is whatever form of communication that allows a student to achieve autonomous, independent communication with ease and in a way that's like actually enjoyable for them, right? That's a big piece of the picture. So that could look like written communication or some version of picture exchange or a low-tech version of an alternative augmentative communication device, sign languages, any of those sorts of things. None of those modalities or options are inferior to one another. It's all about what's most accessible to the individual student. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Ashley. And we just love this quote by Troy Kotzer. It's really important for me on stage to show emotion through sign language. And I think any of you watching today will be seeing the demonstration that Greenie is actually giving by putting emotion into the sign language and not just, I suppose, transcribing everything we're saying. It's not just as a simple transcription. There is so much more. It is so three-dimensional and really gives a lot of meaning than speaking dialogue. So this video of Troy is a recent clip of an interview that he did, and it's entirely in ASL and verbal interpretation. And it's done in subtitles with no audio. And the reason for this is really to equalize the deaf perspective. It highlights the importance of representation as well. You know, we see so often, and we've spoken about representation and how important it is, but we see disabled roles are not often portrayed by actors with disabilities. And in his speech, Troy speaks to the power of this specific representation and how it is changing perspectives. And I think it's really important when we're sort of seeing obviously his message and the importance of representation, and all of us actually being able to be brought into the deaf culture and the add-on and the value that it adds to our lives. But one of the other really important things when we're thinking about language and how it can actually impact others is thinking about ending the expectation of toxic positivity. And I think at times we can all obviously be guilty of this, but I think the important thing to remember here is students with disabilities grow up to be disabled adults, and sometimes messages of toxic positivity that begin in childhood and adolescence are continually then reinforced into adulthood. And what that actually starts to breed is internalized ableism, to think I'm not good enough if I'm not achieving this. And we can combat this by making conscious changes to the language we are using, and changing our language actually changes our messaging. And this is really, really important. So I'll give some examples now. So for example, it's easy to say, you have to stay positive. You know, if someone is sort of feeling like they're in a moment of almost despair or really struggling, but rather than saying you have to stay positive, you can see things like, it's okay, it's hard to stay positive right now, like understanding, and that's actually giving that person the permission to feel the way that they're feeling. Another one is, it could always be worse. And I think this is something that sometimes naturally we can say without thinking. But maybe instead of saying it could always be worse, we could say things like, I understand that you're going through a hard time. Again, acknowledging the emotions and the feelings that individual is having. The age-old one, never give up. You know, and I think all of us want to have this positive attitude, right? And sometimes we don't want to give up. Sometimes we want to push through. But being told never to give up actually sometimes just reinforces all these different things, like it's up to me to make this happen. But sometimes it's actually okay to say it's okay to give up sometimes. You know, what would the outcome be if you did? You know, sometimes if something is so hard, and particularly for students with disabilities, and to say never give up, keep pushing. But if there are other barriers that are out of their control, sometimes it's okay, all right, let's find an alternative. Let's find something else. And actually, if this isn't going to be the end result and the end goal, is that okay? It will work out how it's meant to be. And I think it's tricky when we start thinking about meant to be, right? It's one of those things that sometimes we say when, if there's a bad thing that's happened in someone's life, or something didn't quite go their way, you know, we'll say, oh, it's meant to be. But really, I think, again, acknowledging how that person feels. So I understand that you wish things were different. These are all very minor changes actually in our language. Again, sort of saying the same message, but all it is doing is actually acknowledging the person on the receiving end and potentially how they are feeling in that moment. Life isn't always fair. Try saying instead, you're right, it isn't fair. And then the other one, you can do anything. And I think we want to make sure that we're setting expectations on people, absolutely. And within the school environment, we want our students to have expectations, and we want those to be set appropriately. But I think we also need to acknowledge if someone is finding something really hard, or that they can't actually finish something in the way that they thought they might be able to, or that they're finding it difficult, it's okay to say it is perfectly okay if you can't do something. You know, you can respect your limitations as much as you can actually set expectations as well. And I think, you know, if we're thinking about what allyship looks like and how our role can play in this, truthfully, a lot of that conversation in the broader disability circles centres around adults and how adults can be allies, obviously, to the disability community. But in actuality, students can be allies as well. And I think, in fact, they can be very, very powerful allies. And they can give true friendships and genuine connections. And this is crucially important, understanding, you know, how do students create relationships? How do your children create meaningful friendships? And just like adults, allyships with students looks like a genuine effort, and it is at the core of disability inclusion, and really to the core of what we're trying to create when we're thinking about welcoming communities within our school. So understanding around allyship is that it's always ongoing, and the development of relationships. So similar to when we think about the learning of language and how it's evolving, and that is always a process of learning, unlearning, relearning, so is allyship. And, I think things that we can think about how it looks within the environment is making sure that the disabled community's voices are raised alongside of and not on behalf of. We've spoken about the power of language, we've spoken about representation today, and it is just so important. We want to make sure we're using language that empowers. So thinking about, how is that person feeling on the receiving end of our communication? And listening and deferring to disabled voices. It is so important. Individuals with disabilities can be allies too. And I think this is also the piece, for all of you who have students who have disabilities, they are in a very unique situation in the fact that obviously they have lived experience. And so how they can actually be that support system for somebody else with a disability is a huge piece. Being immersed in disability representation, again, I think we've said that enough, but it is so, so important, and making genuine connections. And I think what allyship is not, and hopefully something that you've really heard today, is using language that is demeaning rather than empowering. We really want to be precise in the language that we're using and really make sure that the person that we're communicating with is feeling empowered. So, truthfully, a lot of that conversation of, the broader allyship is that students should be included in the conversation. And a lot of the time that students can be allies too. And I think we really need to make sure that that is at the forefront of what we're trying to promote and what we're trying to do within the school environment. So, getting to the heart of the power of language, efforts of inclusion that do not directly address usage of language will fall short. We know that it is such an important component, and without it, we really can't move forward in some pieces. It will actually stop conversations in its tracks. So how can we ensure that we are letting inclusion and respecting the preferences of the disability community guide using language? So, be intentional about word choices around disability. Willingness to learn and unlearn and relearn, we've already spoken about that. Honouring personal preferences regarding identity and not trying to impose our own views on others. Practicing patience with those who use varied forms of the communication. Sometimes there may be silence, but actually giving people permission to reply if they're using an AAC device or another part of communication. If you're speaking with somebody who potentially is using an interpreter, making sure you're actually acknowledging the person that you're speaking with. You don't need to speak to the interpreter. Readiness to get to know each other. The power of language, and language actually allows us to have wonderful conversations. And we spoke about that last week in how we make connections, finding those commonalities and sort of respecting people's differences and embracing those differences. And then understanding how to best support one another. I think, it's just such an important piece of all those different steps. So anyone here on this webinar tonight, likely has a child with a disability or, has a student within your class that has a disability. So what are some actionable ways to make sure that we are using language as a tool? Think about checking with the power of your language use. Think about your language choices when talking about disability. And in all languages, identify and shift away from ableist language where you can. Have conversations with your student, read the preference or self-identification or your child, what are they wanting? How are they speaking? What part of their identity are they wanting to either, have come first or maybe not? Where are they at their moment? And pay attention to language used at school by teachers, PTA leaders and others. Speak up respectively and educate. Call them in. We spoke about calling out and calling in. And there's lots of different ways where you can actually do that to educate others, and encourage your child to speak up and communicate during IEP and 504 plan meetings. That can really be in a moment where they can say, this is my preference. This is how I want to be communicated with.
So the conversation around language and how we are using language is a huge part of our Just Say Hi curriculum. It's woven into like every part of the curriculum is a respect for that conversation and a respect for wanting to get that right. And so what does our Just Say Hi program, what does that bring to the table? It brings to the table the work that is required for allyship and embedding concepts of this into every element of conversation, of friendships, of leadership within our. And this little video clip, for those of you who haven't got to join us for earlier webinars in this series, really speaks to how inclusion in a posture of allyship is really at the core of the Just Say Hi program and its mission.
Thank you. There are many of us out there who think that we're doing inclusion right and we don't have to do anything else to be inclusive, but it's important to have a program to help. Inclusion is important.
Kids are growing. They don't know what to do with someone that may be different.
If somebody's in a wheelchair, they don't know how to talk to them.
I wish that people understood about how it feels like to have a disability.
The Just Say Hi curriculum has served as an anchor and a scaffold for how we can look critically at our curriculum.
And like, as you say hi, there are other things you can talk about, and that really helps to make new friends.
If a new kid came into the school, I would say, welcome to the class.
What makes a great school is a culture and climate to the building that celebrates diversity and rallies the community around supporting every single child.
So what does Just Say Hi offer? We offer a curriculum that truly is for all stakeholders, because a school community isn't just students, right? It's students, of course, both with disabilities and without, but it's also families of students and educators and staff and school administrators and everyone involved that makes up the school community as a whole. So part one of this is that we offer a pretty robust professional development series for educators and staff that's all evidence-based and steeped in best practices. It's been peer reviewed and co-developed with experts from every stakeholder group. And we've also co-developed 84 lesson plans, probably more than 84 at this point, that are all focused on disability inclusion. And these have been, again, developed with stakeholder experts, as well as school counselors of the year and teachers of the year, educators with disabilities. And the cool part about our lesson plan compendium is that it really is meant to be used across all different school environments. There are lesson plans for ELA and history and STEM and the arts and music. So really it's designed to be used wherever it is needed. And the third part, of course, are these family engagement webinars that we've had the privilege of hosting with the NYCDOE. And we've really enjoyed that. It really is experience that so what can we do to bring all that wonderfulness to your school? Well, we'd really love your investment and your involvement and making sure that we're spreading the word about the Just Say Hi program among fellow parents and guardians without disabilities, of course, advocating for bringing the Just Say Hi program to your school, reaching out to your counselors or principals, other relevant folks to help get this in the door, engaging PTA leaders about webinars to your school, and of course, just continuing to advocate for disability inclusion as the best interest of your entire school community, really, because it is that disabled kids deserve a curriculum that makes them feel seen and a curriculum that works to help ensure their full inclusion in their school community. So we thank y'all so much for being here with us this evening. We've had a fabulous time. And at this time, we would like to open up the floor for some questions.
All right, folks, you heard it. We got about 6 minutes to answer any questions that you may have. I'm not seeing anything in the chat at the moment, or in the Q&A at the moment, but feel free. We'll give it a few minutes and we'll talk. And I think one of the things, as both of you were talking, that really struck a chord with me is that it's not just the language that we use determines the equity we practice, right? And I think that makes a huge impact in the lives of other folks, especially. Oh, I'm not even on screen, guys. I'm not even spotlighting myself. 1 second. There we go. So yeah, the language we use dictates the equity that we show and we live. And I think it's very interesting when you were talking, Ashley, about those little slurs that we don't even notice are slurs anymore because they've just made it into common language, right? Calling things stupid, dumb, lame. I had a sign that was so I'm a fan of unicorns, and I had a sign that my sister had given me to put on my desk that said unicorns are lame, and in small print below said no one ever. And it's a sign that I loved, and I was in the middle of a video chat, right? And you could see, and I put it behind me in my office, and I was meeting with a friend who's also a disability advocate, and in the middle of the meeting, at the end of our meeting, as folks were signing off, she said, Jose, can I stay on with you for a couple of minutes? And this was a great opportunity of showing how to call someone in. She said, so I just want to tell you something. That sign behind you actually makes me feel a certain way because this is what this language actually means. I felt mortified, right? Because in my mind, it clicked in that second. You're absolutely right. But I never thought of that until someone pointed it out to me. So I think the reason I say all of this is it's why it's important to call people in when you're having conversations, because I truly, honestly have to believe that most people, when they do these, for lack of a better term, microaggressions by using it based in language, most people don't know the hurt that they're causing and would hopefully not want to do it if it called in. I said a lot. Thoughts on there?
Yeah, no, I think, Jose, that is just so important because, there's two parts, right? When we're talking about calling in or calling out, obviously, if someone is using a slur, then calling somebody out on that, to say, hang on, stop, this is really inappropriate. You really shouldn't use that word. You shouldn't use that language. But when, I have been absolutely guilty of using the word crazy. You're like, oh, this is just driving me crazy, and those different things. And I think being conscious and understanding to say, all right, am I offending anybody? But also I can just change that word. I can say things like, this is very frustrating to me. Like I can actually take responsibility for my language, still actually convey my message in a really fun and appropriate way, or, have that emotion and do it and actually be more thoughtful. And I think precision is such a strong word here to think about, how are you describing something? By actually using those sort of broader terms, you're not describing it in a very effective way. So the person receiving that message could take it in any way. They could take it as going, okay, is Jose being funny, or is Rachel being funny, or are they angry? Are they upset? It's actually, quite difficult if you're on the receiving end sometimes of communication that's using those words to say, I'm not quite sure of the person's intent. And so I think, when we're thinking about the language that we're using, it's very quite simple and thoughtful to actually think about, well, what other word can I replace it with to convey my message?
Absolutely. I wonder if you all have any tips or advice on how do you deal with when you do try to call people in and then the response is, oh, you're being too sensitive, right? Because there are folks who might think like that's I've been in situations before when I've tried calling someone and they're like, "You're being too sensitive. You need to give me some freedom, some grace, some flexibility." I can't imagine that's ever happened, Ashley.
Oh, no, never. Not ever, not once. So, and personally, like lame is the word that I have been both called in and called out about my usage of, which is a good thing, right? And once was by my dad, actually. It's like, no, that was the word spastic. So I remember this like clearly as day, 6th grade. I called my sister a spaz. I was like, "You're being such a spaz right now." And my dad turns to me and he goes, "You might want to like rethink your usage of that word because you are literally a spaz. Like you literally have spastic diplegia and you shouldn't use that in a derogatory way because that means that you view yourself in a derogatory way." And I was like, 13-year-old Ashley, that's not something I'd ever thought about before. So disabled people are far from immune from doing this. Like we do it too. And recently I have been called in about lame. And so I have changed and I don't use that word, not even casually. But when people do come back at you, and they will, about sensitivity or like, "Oh, you're making a big deal out of nothing," my go-to is, that may be your perception that I'm being too sensitive. But what's the more important perception? Your perception that I'm being too sensitive, or the perception of the person who is potentially hurt by your language? And the answer to that question is always going to be the perception of the person that's potentially hurt by your language. Regardless of how any one individual might feel about one of these casual examples of ableism, if someone else, either in your life directly or indirectly, is telling you that what you're saying is hurtful, then like your only job in that situation is to listen. Like not to rebuke it or to explain it away or make an excuse for it, just to listen and say, "Okay, I hear you. I will know better and do better moving forward."
Thanks so much.
Jose,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, a lot of people get defensive or go back with those different things because they probably feel uncomfortable, right? Like when we get called out or where we get called in, it also makes us feel uncomfortable. And some people need a little bit more time to process. So they get defensive and go, "Oh, no, I didn't mean it." Or, I was right, you're wrong, or whatever that might be. But it's really important. Someone just put this in the chat, to give also people permission to forgive themselves, because I think there's a moment where when you're getting called in or when you're getting called out, as you said, when someone spoke about your unicorn sign, like how that made you feel. Like it does make you feel in that moment going, "Oh, I didn't mean it that way. I'm really sorry," all those different things. And so, people being defensive is sort of almost a natural reaction sometimes, and sort of giving permission to be able to have conversations, trying to create a safe space. Obviously it's different when it's a slur. I do think there are some words like the R word, for example, you can call someone out on that. We all know that it's not a word you should use, like that's pretty clear. But when it's these other sorts of things where someone is not meaning to cause harm, trying to create a safe space to have conversation and giving them permission to respond, and not necessarily fighting back if it is defensive.
Yeah. That's a great response. There's a question in here about how can we get this information into every household, and I'm just going to be very shameless plugging here. We're recording. We're going to upload this to YouTube, and so you can help us get this into every house by sharing the link to the recording. CPF has done some amazing sessions with us. We're going to have one more next week, and then we're going to have them join us for our family forum. So there is going to be more content for families from Cerebral Palsy Foundation. And just to be clear, I want to say this, just because the Cerebral Palsy Foundation is doing this with us, this isn't just for families who have family members with cerebral palsy. It is for folks with all disabilities. This content is amazing. And honestly, it's just for every human being to go through this and understand, because if you don't have a disability, there is someone with a disability in your life. So this is important for everyone. So I want to thank you all for joining once again, and looking forward to our next session next week. For those of you who have stuck around with us, I have a very quick announcement. If you are a parent of a child with an IEP, you may know that we are in the process of changing our system for IEPs, which is commonly known as CSIS. And the DOE is looking for families who have current students with IEPs to participate in a feedback cycle of the new system. So if you are interested, please send us an email at beyondaccess@schools@nyc.gov. And we would love to get you into communication with the technology folks who are helping build the system. So if you're interested in being part of that, I keep saying feedback group, but there's an actual word for these things. What are they called? Focus group. There you go. If you're interested in being part of this focus group, please send us an email, beyondaccess@schools@nyc.gov. So, announcement out of the way. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you CPF again for the amazing content. Thank you Greenie for the amazing ASL interpretation. Ulisse, see you. Thank you for translating for us. And everyone, we'll see you all next week. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Oh.